What a garden intended, what the gardener needs to know, and what we can expect it to be able, her to be able to say, is what is the intended supernatural power of the garden, and therefore of each plant one by one. The answer, depending on the culture, will be, of course, to feed or to cure, and that's what it's going to come up with. The pollen counts at Wye House in the greenhouse show some of the plants in the slave quarter and some of those in the greenhouse. Our choice, which is a real choice because there are hundreds, for listing here is determined by the complexity of the environment created for such an array. In the greenhouse from 1775, in other words, for the Revolution, to 1790, the beginning of the Federal era, there were decorative plants, but I don't think they were decorative. Pond lilies, water soldiers, and iris. Then there was snakeroot, phlox, and ginseng, which are used for gout, fever, and as stimulants or poultices. These were medicinal plants. For household use, are field and scouring rush, that is to say things that are really scratchy and you can clean dishes with, and impatiens used for making a dye. In the slave quarter, there were more local food plants like ground cherries, arrowhead, blueberries, and cranberries. There were also medicinals like wild ginger, saxifrage, and knotweed. These are for stomach pains, urinary tract infections, and aches and pains. This list establishes two things. There was a substantial array of plants in the greenhouse when it was built in the 18th century. It was big and full of plants. The array continued into the mid-19th century and began to include citrus. And citrus requires temperatures in February of between 52 and 62 if they are to survive. And I mentioned that not to celebrate lemon trees, lime trees, and orange trees, but to see what the controlled environment was in a building like that, and the temperature and the water pump and the skill needed to make these things happen. There's a constant adjustment of the temperature. Second, there were local plants of many practical uses. They continued to be cultivated well into the 19th century. Today, burdock grows in large quantities around the yard area where a slave quarter stood at Wye House. Burdock is used as a folk medicine to treat gout, rheumatism, and dropsy. It is also used as a diuretic, an antibiotic, and an anti-inflammatory. Slave narratives talk about roots being soaked in whiskey. Okay, so now it's going to be time for the break. So you can get some. Treated to unspecified illnesses and mixed with citrate of potash for scrofula. I mean, this sounds like the Middle Ages, doesn't it? We also know dandelion acts like aspirin, and watercress is high in vitamin C. We have the botanical families that include dandelions and watercress in the pollen, so they're there. That's not a surprise. Dandelion can deal with kidney problems because it is a diuretic, and also deals with liver problems, which appear as jaundice. Dandelion is everywhere here and helps with swollen extremities, including symptoms of dropsy, or plantain, that is to say, a symptom of dropsy. Plantain, which is the weed in your garden that we all hate, and not the tropical fruit, when made into a poultice, is a way to heal burns. A different plant lifts depression. We found these because we looked, and that's the idea, look. We would not call these plants a set of medicines in the modern sense. I don't think that's right. That's not where we're going. But they do have healing properties that have real effects like this. They reduce anxiety. They reduce pain. They lower blood pressure. They reduce bodily stressors by being analgesics, Tylenol, antibiotics, and anti-inflammatories. Think about ibuprofen. Now, they don't work as well, and that's not what they are, but they have some of those ingredients in them. Once a local cure is tried and produces any of these side effects, the body's own healing process can be more effective. That, of course, is a hypothesis, but it's probably true. Some ailments can be managed this way, and that includes headaches, toothaches, fever, burns, strains, sprains, cramps, indigestion, warts, nosebleeds, and some sores. Okay, so that's really the idea of a local pharmacopoeia that exists through the pollen, that we see through the pollen, that is in that nexus, not in the greenhouse particularly, although that's where the pollen comes from, but now one can see that there's what's called a materia medica, that the Lloyds share not simply with their slaves, but with African descendants, and then with the people on the hill who are free and who are a single community. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. There's a whole medicine here. It makes sense at this point to say that there are no remedies in the two Lloyd cookbooks that we have that come down to us, and we've read pretty carefully, except a lot of bourbon. This is a surprise, of course, because the books themselves are plantation care books and recipes for whitewash and silver and marble polish, and this is what makes them so fascinating. Therefore, one function of the plants we have listed is medicinal, and they may be magical as well. But I don't mean magical in the sense of a rabbit's foot, because that doesn't appear to have any function except psychological. These things had psychological function, but they also had actual practical function as well. And they can be seen as part of the action of the African spirit world that we have evidence from and for in the two bundles in the greenhouse, including, and on other things that are not on display, the two-faced doctor figurine from the captain's cottage, and the big collection, which we're just turning up now, of deliberately buried iron implements beneath a 19th century slave quarter that we know of at Wye. This is all about magical practice that incorporates medical practice. Okay, midwives had to have existed at Wye House and here, and these served the enslaved, the free, and white communities. We learn that, like their plantation predecessors, in other words, in plantations and after emancipation, through the early 20th century, midwives harvested their own herbs rather than purchasing them from a store or a general environment. A well-stocked midwife's cabinet would contain digitalis, belladonna, lobelia, sage, henna, rhubarb, mayapple, bloodroot, wild cherry, and lots of others. And she would have cultivated them herself. And that's what one wants to see in the gardens, next to the quarters, or in the fields, next to the fields, at any of these plantations that are common throughout here. Like the old conjurers, who are known as swampers, for a good reason. Most midwives were skilled herbalists, knowledgeable both in the identification of and use of plants and other natural substances, including certain kinds of clay and insect nests, which are, of course, a mix of all these seeds that have been pulverized and turned into a kind of daub. Ceremonies, rituals, practices involved a holistic approach to treatment and support. In the absence of pain medication, the granny, the midwife, the conjure doctor, the root doctor, the two-headed doctor, the two-faced doctor, sometimes also called a granny. It depended on the power of self-hypnosis and suggestion to frame her ritual practice as she placed, and this is an interesting part of it, a sharpened axe under the laboring woman's bed in the belief that the sharpened axe would cut the pain. But to time the birth, she used a natural timing device, a dried fern with tightly curled fronds. She put the dried plant into a bowl of water and watched the fronds unfold. They gave full information, she believed, about the child's progress on its journey into this world. If the leaves caught on one another and opened unevenly, she feared trouble and resorted to action. The value of this charm was famous, at least in parts of the South. And red, especially red string, was used for any woman of childbearing age, especially with a history of difficult pregnancies. One can understand the fern, but it's more difficult to understand the red string. But you look at these African American gardens and you see the color red everywhere. Slave medical practice includes conjurers, root doctors, and midwives, and they passed on a vast body of knowledge of naturopathic healing techniques. This old tradition accumulated a storehouse of knowledge: pennyroyal tea used for complaints, sassafras tea, mint tea used for abdominal problems, and Spanish moss for asthma. We think there are two complementary ways to look at these plants. One is as a home for spirits. That's the religious way. This is a place where the spirits dwell and hide during the day. The second we get from Linnaeus, and that is the idea that plants can be arranged to tell the time from the position of the blossoms or the blooms and the leaves during the night and the day. He calls this a floral clock, and there are some good illustrations in the loop. We get this idea from my colleague. I gave a talk on this stuff almost a year ago at the CUNY Graduate Center in Manhattan, and this guy came up to me and said, have you ever thought of a floral clock? And I just about died. Well, here's the floral clock. Imagine the gardens at Wye House, and now we're going to turn to the idea of a floral clock. There is a natural rhythm to the landscape. The opening and the closing of flowers, the path of the sun across the sky, and movements like the sounds of animals. People can understand the passage of time this way, and all of us do, even if we're not on a farm. You can do this on a city street. This intuitive sense of timekeeping seems to be in contradiction to the strict segmentation of our days now into hours, minutes, and that's called factory time, and it was invented late in the 18th century. When the day became regimented by minutes on the clock, rather than I have to check to see how much time I have left here, corresponding, that's what we do, you understand. We're completely captivated by this thing and controlled by it. The world of the closing of the owning classes, that's us, during this time became more segmented and ordered place, including conceptions of time, which of course we think are real. However, if you think about the gardens at Wye House, you have to realize there is not much separation on the plantation between an intuitive and natural timekeeping and an artificial or an ordered one. They're probably not divorced until the middle of the 20th century. For us, there is a rhythmic pattern to daily life. Despite the power that the clock has over us now, the sights and sounds that make up the everyday world in everyday life help us to position ourselves throughout the day. Most interesting to add to this idea is how the multiple ways of orienting ourselves in time and space would have come together in a plantation landscape. Different residents of Wye House would have experienced the landscape in a variety of different ways depending on their status, their race, and their ideology. African American slaves would have developed a different sense of the plantation landscape based on where they were permitted to be, but in fact we know they were everywhere. This creates two different landscapes in the same plantation, one black and one white. Adding a temporal dimension to this idea helps to create the experience or to complete the experience. Movement through space and movement through time are intertwined, and the two groups of people at Wye House would have navigated these movements simultaneously. Edward Lloyd Forr, whose family owned the Wye House plantation since the middle of the 17th century, was interested in scientific gardening, and there's lots of stuff in the Wye House library to show that. He, like other curious men of the time, what they called themselves was curious men, curious gentlemen, was concerned with the observation and understanding of nature. Scientists in the 18th and 19th century were beginning to discover that nature had its own innate sense of time, which we call circadian rhythm. It's the daily rhythm, which also determines human sleep patterns, dictates the movement of plants in their leaves and flowers throughout the day. And this was experimentally worked out even earlier by a French botanist, de Marin. And he found that rather than responding directly to the sun, and this is key to understanding this, the plant followed some form of its own genetic timing in its motions, and they existed for the plant even in a darkened room. Not long after Linnaeus, who is of course known for the famous system that we still use of naming, he concerned himself with the precise timing of plant movements. He describes plants as having a sleeping cycle, which we've heard about, explaining that the positions of plant leaves changes from night to day. He separated flowers into groups depending on the ways they kept time. So certain flower petals, Linnaeus found and recorded, opened and closed at precise times every day, regardless of the weather and the time of year, so it isn't seasonal. These plants he called equinoctials. The repeated motion is so regular, he proposed that a comprehensive list of these combined observations, that is, of equinoctials, from various climates would allow anyone to tell the time of day without the use of a clock. His insights culminated in the theory of a floral clock. I'll spare you the Latin name, which I also can't pronounce, which has since been illustrated and even attempted by gardeners. While it is theoretically possible to create such a clock, it has rarely been successful. Let's just say it didn't work. Instead, many gardens have incorporated a mechanical clock into a flower bed, integrating the segmented factory time with the natural rhythms of the plants.